Welcome to Byju's classes, and here we take you again once more on an interesting voyage across continents to review the international events of the past week, events that have been beautifully curated for you, aspirants of the civil service examinations, events that impact on our national interest and are most likely to change the existing power equations. One of unexpected and interesting developments in the past week was a large-scale protest demonstration in the eastern city of Khabarovsk in Siberia. The city has a population of just a little over 500,000, and when the demonstrators came out on the roads, they numbered between 30,000 to 40,000. So one can imagine that this was a massive demonstration, and it was unprecedented in more than one ways. This is the area which had voted against the constitutional amendments proposed by President Putin. This is where he has received the lowest approval ratings all along. But what made the events rather interesting was that the governor of this province, a young governor, just a little over 45 years, was arrested on charges of murder in which he was implicated when he was a metal scrap trader some 15 years back. Now, nobody believed that these charges were suddenly pressed against him and this old investigation had been reopened because of this murder allegations. Everybody believed, at least in his city where he is very popular, the province where he is very popular, that this was to admonish him for not having delivered his province and the city in the accounts of Putin when he was proposing the constitutional amendments. Some even suggested rather cheekily that President Putin did not approve of any young contender who might become a rival in years to come. Putin, let's not forget, is on the threshold of 70s, and this Sergei Furgal is under 50. Now, it is also not that he was a critic of Putin all along. He has served in the Duma in Moscow. He has served in the state legislature, and he has been very popular because he has sold the yacht which his predecessor had bought for his use to cut down the expenses and increase the coffers of the state. He has accepted a reduction in his own salaries, and he has undertaken a lot of policy steps which have made him popular. Now, he was arrested in sight of his supporters. He was taken off ingloriously from his SUV and flown to Moscow, more than 3,500 kilometers away. All this has not stopped the protest, which points out two interesting things. Is Putin trying to demonstrate to the world that now he is so confident that he can allow protests to take place, maybe even in remote Siberian cities? Or is it that his police force, his paramilitary forces are not used to dealing with demonstrators? So they just don't know how to cope with it. And all these forces were also part of the state law and order machinery. So we will have to wait and watch what happens to this protest movement of Sergei Furgal in Khabarovsk in Siberia, how Moscow reacts to it in the long run. Russia had to face another allegation, embarrassing, not so much for Putin's Russia, because Putin perhaps wanted to demonstrate what he was doing clandestinely, and he was making others realize that he had a reach which was covert, which could destabilize their polities, but embarrassing for the leaders who were supposed to have been implicated in this sensational disclosure. There was an intelligence committee report in Britain which had been not made public for past 18 months, and it was suggested by a senior MI6 operative, British intelligence service officer, that Boris Johnson was sitting over this report because it showed how Russia had compromised the Brexit vote and how that had helped Boris Johnson win power. Now, if one recalls, similar charges were leveled against Russia for interference in the presidential election when Trump won. Until this date, despite the impeachment of the president and his various efforts to subvert the course of justice, destroy evidence, it has not been proved conclusively that there was no such interference. Russia, of course, has denied it, but people believe that Putin has a hold over Trump because the disclosure of the emails about Hillary Clinton or whatever it was had some basis in reality. Now, this time, it brings the similar kind of a strategy in interference of domestic politics of another country in Britain. And it is also alleged that it is not only the Conservative Party which was influenced by the Russians. There are allegations of large-scale donations, money coming in from Russia, which is referred to euphemistically as Russian gold, which has made impact on this. Right now, the problem is that even when the report is made public, is tabled, the government will be fully within its right to say, in the interest of national security, not everything can be disclosed to public, which would mean that certain crucial areas would always remain covered. Now, what people admit is that even if Brexit was not involved, probably the Scottish referendum was influenced by the Russians. Now, interestingly, there are very interesting aspects to this dimension. Russians are, under Putin, not inhibited about using crude military force and annexations like in Crimea, or using mercenaries like they are using in Africa, or supporting different factions in the civil war in Middle East. But they also have a very interesting capacity to conduct cyber war, to conduct raids, and to subvert the democratic political systems of Western democracies. So this is something which we'll have to carefully wait and watch. What makes things rather interesting is that there also have been apprehensions that the Russians and the Chinese are using their cyber warfare capacities, their hacking prowess, to try to steal the scientific experiments for the vaccine development for COVID. So if that happens, nothing in the Western world is secure from a massive attack from Russia or from China. Abu Dhabi in the UAE, one of the Emirate Sultanates, has been very active in recent past in diplomatic arena, in international affairs. One surprising development which pleasantly surprised the dwellers of the Gulf and the rest of the world was the launch of a rocket to explore the planet Mars by Abu Dhabi. This rocket had been designed with cooperation with American universities, American laboratories, and industries which are active in the field of space exploration. The rocket was launched from Japan. The rocket cost 200 million US dollars. It was not a large sum as far as Abu Dhabi is concerned, but what is interesting is that it brought to a climax things which had been happening in the past few months. There had been citizen of Abu Dhabi who had traveled to a space station. There has been talk about looking for alternatives which free Abu Dhabi from its dependence on oil and make its future safe by developing options of education for scientific research, which are resources for revenue for Abu Dhabi and the rest of its brethren in the Gulf. Interestingly, India, which has had very close and cooperative relationships with Abu Dhabi and the rest of the Gulf countries, missed out on this opportunity of collaborating in this rocket launch. India, as we know, has launched much before anybody else a probe on the Mars. An Indian Prime Minister during his first term in office had made a very generous offers to his neighbors in South Asia and also some nations in Southeast Asia which did not have the potential for undertaking space exploration on their own, that how India could help them out with launch of their satellites and they could be partners in this progress. Now, the satellites are used for a variety of reasons. They can be for better mapping, for geostationary positioning. It should be for communications, for forecasting weather. But what is interesting is that at the same time, the rocket technology, which is used for peaceful purposes, can also be deployed for military purposes. And some people have suggested that this might be one of the reasons why Abu Dhabi and the Gulf countries are very keen to acquire this technology. Iran is a rival. Iran has potential of developing nuclear weapons. It also can look forward to having rockets at its disposal because Iran has recently signed a long-term agreement with China where the two countries will collaborate in weapons development, in technological research, and so on. Iran has been arrayed on the other side of the battlefront from Saudi Arabia and UAE. There have been attacks on oil installations in Saudi Arabia by drones allegedly from Iran, and also the rebels in Yemen have targeted the same sensitive strategic targets. So probably keeping in mind the threat from Israel, keeping in mind the threat from Iran, the Saudi Arabs and those the sultanates in the Emirat are very keen to protect their own defenses. Now, this might be possible, but what the question is interesting is how did India miss out on this opportunity? Because India had made an offer to its neighbors in South Asia, to its some countries in Southeast Asia, which lacked this technological promise and potential, that India could generously help them out with this technology of space exploration, of weather forecasting, of communications, of mapping, and also generally, if this rocketry is promoted and is a collaborative enterprise, there is a coincidence of a strategic interest. The Indian Prime Minister had made this offer in his first term in office, and since we have worked hard at developing closer and friendly ties with Abu Dhabi and the rest of the Gulf countries, how did we miss out on this is something which we have to consider. The warlike confrontation between People's Republic of China, the United States of America, and its West European allies continues unabated. Last week brought some tensions to surface, which were far more hostile and did not augur well for future. These related to the functioning of the telecom company Huawei, which has a massive presence not only in America, but in Britain, but in Germany also. President Trump is very worried about Huawei. He thinks that this company is owned by the government of China. It has very great security risk, and any system using this, a telecom company or a government, becomes vulnerable to the Chinese blackmail, pressure, subversion, etc. Earlier, the British Prime Minister had said that it would not be possible for Britain to extricate Huawei from its telecom companies or transmission systems. It would take at least 4 or 5 years, and it would cost Britain close to 7-8 billion pounds sterling. If any haste was made, it would lead only to waste, and the economy, already stricken by COVID, would take longer to recover. But Trump insisted, put the pressure. Trump's compulsion, of course, is the elections. He has to project to his constituents that he is the strongest president safeguarding American and Western interests vis-a-vis China. So he ultimately had to yield. But it is also interestingly rumored that the Prime Minister of Britain conveyed through whispers to the Chinese that they are only waiting for a change in the climate. If President Trump fails to get re-elected in the United States of America, the policy might change with his successor taking a more resilient policy attitude towards China. Huawei is confident because Huawei knows that it is impossible for either Britain or Germany or France, for that matter, to remove Huawei overnight. They are more worried about their economic recovery, more worried about the quality of their communications, etc., which depends on the Chinese equipment. Now, the European companies which compete with Huawei, Sweden's Ericsson, Norway's Nokia, are not one but 3-4 steps behind in technology of Huawei. The other companies which are close are Korean companies, Japanese companies, but they are not necessarily compatible or transferable, transplantable on the existing networks. So there is something where the Chinese know that they have a stranglehold and they can afford to be arrogant. This was the case when the Chinese ambassador was, during a television interview, confronted with a video which showed the Muslims Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province of China being herded, shackled, and handcuffed into trains, being taken to concentration camps, where the allegation is that they are being brainwashed, they are being forcibly converted, made to eat pork, and employed in bonded labor, manufacturing things from hair and other things, leather, which they consider not pure and polluting. When the Chinese ambassador was shown this, he just shrugged his shoulders and said, there is a perceptual difference in this too. Whom you call to be people practicing Islam and we are trying to brainwash them are dangerous terrorists indulging in acts of violence. They have done so, including targeting in Peking. And they say that we have to treat them in our, considering what is sensitive for our national interest, our internal security. They also said that how a nation state treats dangerous people of this kind, terrorists, is its own business. Nobody else can dictate to a sovereign nation how to treat them. He skirted the issue of the genocide and he said there is no genocide. We are only trying to re-educate them and bring them back to being more responsible citizens in a society like China, and not go against the ideology which is supported by the majority of the Chinese people and has paid good rich dividends to them. He also added that I'm not denying that there might be a single case or a few cases where human rights have been violated, where excesses have been done, but which country in the world is free from such allegations? Now, at the moment, the Americans are facing the Black Lives Matter movement. They are confronted with the sins of their ancestors since past about slavery, about racism, and not only America, the European countries, the colonial imperial powers also are having this moment of truth. The Americans particularly have tried to get an immunity for their soldiers from war crimes. So at this moment, China cannot be easily cornered either with events in Hong Kong or with what it is doing, genocidal policies maybe, in the province of Xinjiang. Chinese know this very well and can afford to take a tough posture. America, under the presidency of Donald Trump, it seems has gotten into the habit of stumbling from one crisis to another crisis. Before it recovers from a stumble or a fumble, it ends up in another. And what happened last week was exactly this. President Trump ordered federal forces to control unruly mobs. This is a term which he uses liberally for all his opponents, whether they are Democrats, whether they are liberals, whether they are humanists, and he calls them all ultra-left, anarchist, etc. So in the city of Portland, in the state of Oregon, suddenly descended dozens of people dressed up in army fatigues, but surprisingly without any marks, without any labels, without any epaulets, without any identifications, not even the numbers. So one couldn't even make out whether they were government forces or they were vigilantes. And they started harassing people, harassing citizens who were protesting peacefully. And also, President Trump seems to have unleashed these people, which are the Customs and Border Patrol people, very loyal to him, the forces individually to him, but not trained to either control protesters or masses or perform law and order functions. They are trained and specialized forces to have border control against illegal immigrants, against drug traffickers, against flesh traffickers, and against organized criminals. But they are not supposed to be trained to deal with such law and order situations. But President Trump is so arrogant that he says that he doesn't require any permission or any invitation, as his Homeland Secretary said, from any constituent state of the American Union to sort of send these federal forces. Now, the trouble with federal forces is that the federalism in America is far more delicately balanced than it is in India or anywhere else in the world. The states are very, very zealous about protecting their autonomy and rights, and they think the president is transgressing the constitution by sending these federal forces. On the other hand, the president thinks if the states prove themselves incapable of maintaining law and order or controlling rioters, he is perfectly within his rights to deploy these people. Criticism is valid. Why are these federal forces not identified as such? Why are they not identifying themselves as National Guards? Why are they drawn from forces particularly loyal to President Trump himself, the Customs and Border Patrol, for instance? Now, the Attorney General of the state, the mayor of the city, and the governor of the state have all filed cases in the court and challenged President's decision. President is unruffled. He has said that he is not going to be deterred. He is going to deploy these forces wherever he thinks they are fit, wherever the states are weak, and the next target is supposed to be Chicago. Now, Trump's opponents see a game plan in this. He is going for broke. He knows that his popularity ratings are falling far behind under double digits after Biden, and he wants to divide the country into two and project himself as a savior of law and order, savior of American values, savior of American supremacy. He's also sided unabashedly with those who are championing the Confederate flag, championing the statues which the Black Lives Matter were trying to demolish. So he says that they are trying to rewrite history, they are trying to do whatever revisionism, which he will not put up with. So Interestingly, these things were disturbing enough. But even more distressing was an interview which President Trump granted to the Fox television. It was, some people found the interview hilarious, funny, but others thought that it was not hilarious, it was terrifying. When President Trump was put a straight question by the interviewer, would he respect the verdict of the people in the election? The answer was very ambiguous. He said, I will see about it, what happens. And then when he was asked questions about the coronavirus spread, the mishandling of his administration about that, he said, what are you talking about? These are figments of my opponent's imagination. This is all fake news. Then he called for some figures which were not handed over to him in time. He said, look, just trust me. This virus will disappear one of these days. Now, this lack of contact with reality, this supreme arrogance, and this authoritarian streak where it might actually happen that the president, invoking whatever emergency power he imagines he has, might postpone the elections, or the elections might be interfered with because of social distancing and so on. And this would give him a lease of life where he could wreck the American electoral process. He is viewed by many people as the greatest threat to American democracy, American values, and American Constitution. But the judiciary, with nominees backed by the president, again, is not at the moment seen as the custodian of the Constitution by very many Americans who feel threatened. So, combined with President Donald Trump's interview and combined with his reckless deployment of federal forces in states without their consent, without their invitation, and his unilateral interpretation of what the relationship between states and the center is in American Constitution, is causing great concern in America. And this also has obvious implication for America's international relations elsewhere. People say that Donald Trump is so economical with truth. He is so much of a mythomaniac that he might say that he is the toughest president which has confronted China ever. But at the same time, there are whispers of his conveying message to the Chinese that if they buy enough food grains, fodder from American farmers, then of course he would ensure these votes. And if they help him win the election, he might be obliged to them in the same manner and offer them some trade-offs elsewhere, as he did allegedly with the Russians in his first presidential election. So these are issues which are grave issues, which are matters related to America's internal politics, but at the same time, which are absolutely imperatively impinging on international relations. After a long wait, a physical summit of the EU was held in Brussels last week. Before that, there have been many meetings in the cyberspace, but this was the first time when all the leaders came, bumped each other's elbows, avoided physical contact, but were there physically present to talk face to face. And the issue was complex enough because there had been the division within the EU about how to raise almost 750 million euros and how to sort of distribute it among the needy. Now, the problem was that Angela Merkel had always been arguing that this huge sum should be borrowed from the market and given as grant to the most needy, where the frugal northerners, the Austrians, the Danes, the Swedes, were of the view that the people who had not been financially responsible should not be given infinite amount of doles, and this should be strictly monitored and conditioned. Now, countries like Hungary and Poland, who belong to the Eastern European relationship, so to speak, were of the view that there should be no imperative on them, no compulsion on them to bring about changes about human rights, about their legal systems. They insisted that they were sovereign nations and their sovereignty should be respected. The money should be made available to them, but then there should be no conditions attached to it. Now, similarly, there were people who were richer countries where there was growing resentment that repeatedly Portugal, Italy, Greece, etc. had wasted the grants given and not rectified their economic system. So there was this stalemate continuing for a very, very long time. Angela Merkel was trying her best to make EU survive, because already it is under great strain after Brexit. But there was this confusion whether she would be able to pull this rabbit out of the hat. ultimately she did, but one must concede that it is not quite the full rabbit, because they had to concede the demands on two counts of the frugal northerners. They had to A, reduce the total sum of the money which would be given as grant, and also they had to concede that the share to the 7-year budget of the EU of these countries, the countries who were arguing in favor of frugality, would be reduced. So the EU is taking a two-way hit, so to speak, to survive. To maintain the facade of unity, they would say, oh, well, there were occasions where people lost their temper. The French president thumped the table more than once, and the Hungarians and the Poles retaliated in similar kind. They said that, all right, people who have not had sleepless nights often lose their temper. So these exchanges did not help matters. The summit was extended from 1 to 2 to 3 days, but ultimately it left everybody reasonably happy that a compromise had been arrived. But this compromise is no guarantee that the EU will be free from pulls of in different directions by different members, because when it comes actually to raising this money in market and distributing it, bargaining will continue. So this is something which is a temporary reprieve at the most. And Angela Merkel, everybody knows, she will be heading the EU summit for the next 2 years, but there are other countries with ambitions of their own, with national interests of their own, and unfortunately the COVID virus has given a fillip to nationalism, and the recent presidential elections in Poland have also indicated that at least in Eastern Europe, why only in Eastern Europe? In other parts of Europe also, nationalism has been on the resurgence. And when nationalism is on the resurgence, the community of interest is likely to be neglected. This is something which we are bound to be faced with in coming years. So how would be the diplomatic interaction of Europeans elsewhere now that this problem is temporarily resolved, but the Brexit is not? The no-deal Brexit is very much a possibility. Boris Johnson is still on his gambling streak. And also the pressure put by President Trump on his allies not to deal with China is going to create crisis for their economies, their recoveries, in terms of whether they also restrict Huawei, the Chinese telecom company, whether they also take the risk of incurring the wrath of the Chinese. So far, the European Union has not compromised on its principles of defense of human rights, defense of democracy, defense of freedom of expression. But in case of China, whether it is Hong Kong or Uyghur Muslims, the evidence which has been surfacing is fairly damning. But at the same time, there is great reluctance on part of any nation state, a member state in EU, or as EU as a community, to take on China and confront it, because they probably realize with the absence of United States, they are no match to take on China. The US can afford to anger China to a great extent, and it will pay an economic price, but it is not at the risk of survival of a regime. Now, in case of France, President Macron is already again being confronted by orange vests. Again, there is a resistance about his failure of dealing with COVID, his various failures in administrative policies. Organized labor has always been against him. Not only in France, but in Germany also, there have been the rising threat of neo-Nazi racial prejudice. So I think China gets away with lots in terms of violation of human rights, suppressing democracy, because the Americans or the Europeans themselves are not quite in a position to say that they can cast aspersions on others. A speech given by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, has triggered a lively debate in international relations in the past week. Speaking about inequality, the Secretary General said that this is the root cause of all the ills in the world today. He focused on COVID virus pandemic, but he also mentioned various civil war situations. But he said that these ultimately become such devastating crises because the world is divided between the rich and the poor, between those who are colored and those who have a fairer skin, those who are affluent and those who are poor. And this aggravates everything. Now, the interesting part is this, that it is not as if he was saying these things for the first time. This has been said before repeatedly by other people, but he used words which were reasonably harsh. He was sending a reminder to people in power that they should heed to their conscience and try to do something. It is not a question of morality, it is a question of realpolitik. If they don't redress this inequality, they would be leading to a very volatile situation which might explode in their face at any moment. Now, the words were harsh, and some people thought they needed to be said, but people reacted differently to this speech. Some said that the forum he was using and the office he was using itself presides over an institution which perpetuates inequality. The Charter of the United Nations distinguishes between ordinary members and those who are permanent members, veto wielding in the Security Council, who can obstruct any effort at bringing about equality in the international system. And also the amount of money which is contributed towards the specialized agencies of the United Nations, to the annual budget of the United Nations, a large part of it is spent on administrative and tax-free salaries of employees of the United Nations. So can such an organization actually contribute something towards the elimination of inequality? People did not need a reminder. Some people did point out that the people who have died due to coronavirus pandemic in America largely belong to the people who were colored, who lived in slums, who had no access to education or health services, and even those, the rich and the affluent who perished because there has been a systematic subversion of the health system. It has been privatized. The doctors are worried about being sued for medical negligence and so on. The insurance and the hospital nexus plays a very exploitive role. The pharmaceutical companies mark up the prices of life-saving drugs and vaccines 2,000%, 3,000%. And while in the developing countries, there is a thriving black market on these drugs and things. The Secretary General also did point out that the pandemic kills a lot of people and it should be combated on a war front. But the problem is that many more people die in the world of malnutrition, of starvation, of diseases which are not incurable. But the people who are affected by these diseases just can't afford to buy medicines or get treatment because they have neither access to doctors or hospitals, or they can afford the medicines. The infrastructure in the underdeveloped countries is so poor that there is no hope for a person who's stricken with any of these endemic diseases, not forget about the epidemics. Now, the whole of the continent of Africa, no one has any accurate statistics that how it is being ravaged by either Ebola or by malaria or tuberculosis or by malnutrition or by waterborne diseases or children dying of diarrhea. And then comes the number of the coronavirus. People are dying massively in Brazil. The number is just second to of the infected people and the dying people, dead people, than United States of America. People who are stricken by the virus in Italy and France, developed countries, Britain, also have suffered because the health systems have been a lower priority for the governments everywhere, like education has been. They have tried to privatize it. And one of the sad impacts of globalization and the logic of market forces is the privatization of these services has made them almost beyond the reach of a people. There also is apprehension that those who are rich, those who are powerful, would be able to procure for themselves the vaccines of a disease like they do every time for any drug, and then it would be denied to people who need it most in the developing world. So there is this dichotomy between the rich and the poor, between the powerful and the less powerful, and the issues are entwined with each other. Climate change calamity, which is forgotten at the moment because of the pandemic, which might hit us like a ticking time bomb and we find us unprepared. And there would be the sudden surge on the water levels. There might be extension of desertification. There might be destruction of biodiversity. There might be extreme weather conditions. And the Secretary General was doing well to remind people of all these things, which we seem to have forgotten. But the question begs itself: can the United Nations restore its own credibility, either in peacekeeping or in fighting pandemics and diseases? Unfortunately, the WHO itself was under pressure by China, it was alleged, when the COVID virus came. And the Paris conference on climate change has all but become defunct after Trump walked out of it. So, can the United Nations play a role more than rhetorical is something which we must ponder. Benjamin Netanyahu was all prepared to annex the territories of Palestinians where he had settled Israeli refugees, so to speak, after rendering the Palestinians refugee from their homeland when he was caught up in a crisis of his own. He is facing serious charges of corruption and he probably will have to face trial for this. He obviously has denied any charges of wrongdoing, but the charges keep surfacing and resurfacing. Now, the trouble with Israel is that despite repeated elections and re-elections, no single party has come with enough number of votes or a majority to form a government of its own. Whenever there is a coalition, the coalition with like-minded or the opponents is opportunistically forged, and everybody wants their pound of flesh, and no serious business can be settled, and this has helped Netanyahu to remain in power for an extremely long time. But this time it seems that his handling of the coronavirus has also created tensions within the country. There have been protests against him, especially by the younger generation of the Israelis who want a peace dividend, who have a sympathy for the Palestinians who have been mistreated more than once. And I think this ultra-nationalistic posture is not going to carry Netanyahu very far, either in the defense of his own integrity or in the defense of his administration. One other thing about Israel which we need to keep in mind is that Israel is an extremely technologically sophisticated country, an extremely disciplined country, a country with authoritarian rulers, a country which is a disciplined population, which has been trained with compulsory duties in army. But it also has been a long time when it has lived with the mentality of siege. So I think it has no depth. It ultimately is surrounded on all sides by which Israel treats as enemies. It is a small island of Jews surrounded by the hostile Arabs. There is very little depth. And if there is a disease like coronavirus which ravages, if there is internal dissidence, it affects Israel's diplomacy in international arena. In recent past, India has forged close ties with Israel. It has shared intelligence. It has bought military equipment from Israel. It also is collaborating in cutting-edge scientific fields, from pharmaceuticals to combating desertification. Now, we have to keep this in mind that we are not having either or choices. And Israel has been pretty understanding of India's interest, India's Muslim population, the pressures in domestic politics in India, and that it realizes that India has to maintain a reasonably good relationship with countries in the Middle East, in West Asia, to meet its energy requirements, Saudi Arabia, UAE. It has never been created any obstacles in path of India's cultivating these friends, these strategic partnerships. But at the same time, it is for India to keep in mind how far do we commit ourselves to the policies of a particular leader or a government in Israel, which might in long term be counterproductive for us. Fighting had stopped in the civil war in Libya after an unofficial truce, so to speak, which had been effected, though no side accepted a ceasefire proposal. But effectively, fighting had stopped after Haftar had retreated from the siege of Tripoli and vacated the airport of Sirte. But now it seems that the explosive civil war might take a turn for the worse immediately. Egypt passed a resolution in its parliament which authorized the government to deploy its forces outside the country to protect its national interest on the Western Front. Now, this is clearly a sign to say that these forces are going to be deployed in Libya. And the moment this resolution was passed, Turkey immediately declared that it treats this as a declaration of war on the part of Egypt. Egypt and Turkey are arrayed on opposite sides in Libya, and the contention is basically the oil resources. Now, the forces of Libyan Government of National Accord, recognized by UN and by majority of the countries of the world, have started moving towards the airfield of Sirte. And obviously, Haftar is not going to leave it uncontested. So the oil fields are in the territory in eastern Libya controlled by Haftar. The airfield is being contested and the ports are on the other side. So there has to be a government which controls the large tracts of Libya effectively before it can claim to be in recognition. Doesn't mean much in terms of realpolitik. It might be de jure recognition by countries allied to a major power and so on, but this doesn't save a country from the interference from external powers. The Russians have not shown any inclination to withdraw their mercenaries or their support for the rebels, and Egypt is determined to extend its influence here. So how long can Turkey, which is not quite a country which has been involved in the affairs of Africa traditionally, maintain its presence there? So there is this issue which we must worry about in the coming days. And while the world's attention is focused on Libya, civil war in Libya, involvement of Russia, involvement of Turkey, involvement of Egypt, in the same northwestern corner of Africa, violence is occurring elsewhere. In Nigeria, Boko Haram, the jihadi group, works with impunity, inflicting damage on the armed forces of the country. They killed almost 25 Nigerian soldiers, and it accounts for only 25 bodies. There more soldiers might have been killed, and the government has promised that the guilty will soon be brought to book, but these statements are always made. The government in Nigeria has failed to effectively control the activities of these jihadi groups, which rename them, regroup them in different parts of the country, and control tracts of land which is hard to reach. And this has stopped the world from realizing the threat of the collaboration between these various groups, various Islamic jihadi groups. They may be active in Mali, they may be active in Niger, they may be active in Chad, they might be active in Uganda, they might be active in Nigeria. And these carry on a sideshow which is no less dangerous than a full-fledged civil war in Libya. In South Asia, on the borders of India and in the region of Indian Ocean, the challenges to Indian foreign policy and diplomacy continue to be complex. The defense minister visited the Ladakh region frontline after the prime minister, but he came back with mixed signals. What he told the nation was that the nation was determined to repel any incursion within its territory. India had a self-respect and pride which would not allow anybody to get inside, intrude, and occupy any of its territory. He also said the talks were on to diffuse the tension, de-escalate, disengage. But he said, I cannot give you a guarantee that everything will succeed. We hope for the best, but we are prepared for the worst. This much about the Ladakh border. It was also argued that the Chinese incursion in Galwan Valley was only a feint. It might be preparing for a much larger incursion in the Eastern Front. But what is even more deterring is that the government of India tried to respond to the Chinese challenge in both ways. It quoted Nehru's early speeches, which said that if we want to dominate on land, we have to dominate in the seas and we have to dominate in air. So the Indian Air Force was prepared, large-scale purchases have taken place, and Indian ships are doing the rites of passage in the international waters, high seas, in South China Sea, which China claims as its own, along with the two massive aircraft carriers of United States, Nimitz and Reagan. Now, the interesting question is that as long as two massive US aircraft carriers sail through South China Sea or disputed areas, China is not going to take on this challenge and provoke a war. But if Indian naval ships make a presence, a flag showing in support of Vietnam or in support of Philippines, or undertake a deal with them about exploration of oil, will Chinese remain quiet? That is an interesting issue to look. India has also agreed to have the Quad exercise, and once these naval exercises take place, how will the China respond is something which we must consider carefully. There are also strategic experts who say that pressure on land border cannot really be nullified or redressed by show of power on the seas or in the air. So there is, and also some have found it pretty ironical that those who are supporting the dominance of skies and domination of the seas are quoting Nehru, who was supposed to be a pacifist and whose views on China and whose policies on China are supposed to have led us into this sorry situation today. Interestingly, elsewhere in the border also, the problems continue. Another Indian citizen lost his life in a firing from across the border in Kishanganj area, and the Chinese instigation continues in Nepal to provoke India. The Nepalese Prime Minister came out with a dispute, unnecessary dispute, that Ram was born in Nepal, not in India. Ayodhya is originally is a city called in Nepal, not in India. And of course, this hurt sentiments in India and led to very unpleasant situation where a poor Nepalese citizen was tonsured for his Prime Minister's statements elsewhere. On the lighter side, some people living in the world of fantasy in Sri Lanka wanted to say that following in the footsteps of the Nepalese Prime Minister, there should be more research in Ramayana, and if Ravan had a aeroplane, what aerial routes did he follow and dominate? So this, I think we are going to live with this mythological reinterpretation of our historical heritage and try to overburden the disputes on borders or clash of national interest there. So we cannot live in two worlds or ride two horses at the same time. We cannot ride two boats either. We cannot claim shared heritage in the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, in terms of myth, art, literature, culture, and also say that the present day clash of interest between two sovereign states is irreconcilable with that. I think the leadership needs to be more temperate in its use of words. This is all we have for you this week. We shall meet you next week with another set of events reviewed, commented upon, analyzed for your use, incidents from all over the world. Till then, goodbye. We hope that you find this presentation interesting. Please let us know what improvements, what suggestions you have for us.